Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack something that is absolutely mind-bending, the mechanics of paper wealth. We'll be walking through a really fascinating source that critically breaks down how Elon Musk actually hit a staggering $1 trillion net worth right after the SpaceX IPO. We are going to look under the hood at how this specific type of wealth is generated, how it's sustained, and how it's leveraged. It honestly completely changes how you look at modern fortunes. So, quick look at what we're covering today. We've got the trillion-dollar illusion, hype versus fundamentals, the wildly effective buy, borrow, and die strategy, political ties and valuations, and finally, the cost to society. All right, Section 1, the trillion-dollar illusion, visualizing the unimaginable. Okay, so on June 12, 2026, at the NASDAQ exchange, Musk officially became the world's first trillionaire. That is a 1 followed by 12 zeros. It's a number so outrageously huge that our brains honestly just kind of short-circuit trying to comprehend it. To put this into perspective, the source points out that if you were to spend $1 million every single day, it would take you over 2,700 years to run out of money. And if that doesn't quite do it for you, the source uses this brilliant time analogy that really hits the nail on the head. Going back 1,000,000 seconds, that takes you back about 11 and a half days. But going back 1,000,000,000,000 seconds, that takes you back 31,000 years. We're talking about a time before human civilization even existed. It is literally unimaginable scale. But here's the absolute kicker. This wealth isn't sitting in some giant Scrooge McDuck vault. The source makes it clear that we are talking about paper wealth. This fortune is tied up almost entirely in his 38% stake in SpaceX and his 15 to 25% stake in Tesla. It's just a number on a screen, it's highly illiquid and completely dependent on what other investors believe those shares are worth on any given Tuesday. Look at this breakdown. Musk himself has admitted to having only about 0.1% of his wealth in actual cash. That means 99.9% of his fortune is essentially locked up. If he just woke up tomorrow and tried to sell all his shares for hard cash, sheer panic would flood the market. Everyone else would start selling. The share price would tank, and his paper wealth would just instantly evaporate. The whole illusion would shatter. Moving on to Section 2, hype versus fundamentals, valuing the dream. So, if this wealth is entirely based on stock value, you've got to ask, what's driving that price? The analysis brings in economist Burton Malkiel to explain this. He contrasts the firm foundation theory, which is where you value a company based on real, tangible things like revenue and profit, with the castles in the air theory. The source argues pretty strongly that Musk's companies are textbook castles in the air. Investors aren't necessarily buying into current financial realities, they're buying the hype. They're buying into his psychological vision of the future. And the data here is honestly pretty stark. While SpaceX hit a market valuation of $2.2 trillion, research for Morningstar puts its true fundamental value at only $780 billion. That's essentially a third of the market price. This massive gap is happening while SpaceX is actively bleeding cash. We're talking a $5 billion loss in 2025 and then over $4 billion in just the first quarter of 2026 alone. So how does the valuation stay so high? According to the source, it's a continuous cycle of hype. Look at this timeline of bold promises. A 600-mile-per-hour Hyperloop proposed in 2013, humans on Mars promised within a decade in 2014, fully autonomous cars in 3 years back in 2015, and 1 million robo-taxis by 2020. The reality? None of these specific timelines were actually met. But, as the source points out, the paper wealth keeps soaring because the dream just keeps being sold. Which perfectly tees up this quote highlighted in the explainer from famous investor Steve Eisman. You know, the guy who predicted the 2008 financial crash. He famously said, "This is an IPO of a sci-fi story tailor-made for a sci-fi cult." He's basically arguing that investing in this specific brand of paper wealth is less about traditional company metrics and more about buying into a science fiction narrative. This brings us to Section 3. Buy, borrow, and die, the mechanics of living on paper. Now, you might be wondering, if billionaires can't just cash out their paper wealth without crushing their own stock, how on earth do they pay for everything? Well, the source outlines this absolutely fascinating and entirely legal 3-step wealth hack called buy, borrow, die. Step 1, buy. You just hold your stock forever because as long as you don't sell, you don't pay capital gains tax. Step 2, borrow. You mortgage those shares to banks as collateral to get massive, low-interest cash loans to live on. And step 3, die. Thanks to U.S. inheritance loopholes, you can pass those assets and debts to your kids tax-free. And the video gives us a perfect real-world example of this, Musk's purchase of Twitter in 2022. He didn't just sell off $12.5 billion in Tesla stock to get the cash, because actually, that would have triggered a gargantuan tax bill. Instead, he mortgaged $62.5 billion in Tesla shares to secure a completely tax-free cash loan. The source really emphasizes here that when wealthy executives boast about taking a $0 or $1 salary, it's not a selfless act of charity. It's a very calculated, shrewd maneuver to totally bypass income tax. And that strategy leads to this jarring disparity. Think about it. You're probably paying around 20 to 30% of your paycheck in income taxes, right? But the source highlights that the wealthiest individuals pay a tiny, tiny fraction on their wealth increases. Between 2014 and 2018, Musk's effective tax rate on his wealth growth was just 3.2%, which is right in line with the top 25 richest Americans. The system just doesn't treat paper wealth the same way it treats a regular paycheck. All right, Section 4, Political Ties and Valuations, the source's allegations. Now, moving beyond just market psychology and tax codes, the source material dives into some intense allegations regarding political lobbying. Keeping a completely objective view here, let's look at what's being claimed. The analysis argues that this massive paper wealth is heavily inflated by political favors, specifically pointing to an alleged $290 million donation to the Trump 2024 campaign. According to the source, this kind of influence led to unprecedented regulatory rule bending. For example, they claim NASDAQ actually created a fast entry rule just for SpaceX. And even wilder, the source alleges that the SEC waived critical customer protection rules on $70 billion of broker funds literally 2 days before the SpaceX IPO. And the source claims this geopolitical maneuvering extends way beyond the US. The analysis points to India, alleging that their government suddenly drops national security conditions to fast-track a satellite internet license for Starlink in June 2025. What's the connection? Well, the source notes this happened mere weeks after a direct strategic meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Musk in the States. They present this as a clear example of direct political lobbying, artificially inflating paper valuations on a global scale. Which leads us to our final section, number 5, the cost to society. Who pays the price? Because, while we marvel at these unfathomable numbers on a screen, the source begs us to consider the real-world opportunity cost of this untaxed wealth. Look at these numbers. The UN estimates that $40 billion a year could essentially end world hunger. That is a tiny drop in the bucket of this untaxed paper wealth. Or take the Oxfam analysis, which suggests that just a 10% tax on this one fortune could literally lift 800 million people out of extreme poverty. And that brings us to the ultimate question posed by this explainer. If the very mechanics of paper wealth are built on castles in the air, if they're fueled by the buy, borrow, die loophole, and allegedly shielded by political favors just to benefit a few people at the absolute top, who is truly subsidizing this science fiction dream? It's definitely a provocative thought that makes you question the reality of these modern fortunes. Thanks so much for joining me today, and hey, always remember to keep questioning the numbers you see on the screen.